Hey folks, welcome back. Chrontendo episode 42 picks up in February 1989. Once again, rather than covering 15 games, we're going to cover the entire month, 17 games altogether. 4 of these will be games released for the US market in February, including the return of LJN. There's also a few RPGs, kiddie games, and so on. So let's get started. It's February 1989, and we have Tom Sawyer no Bouken from Seta of 8 Eyes fame, or infamy as it might be. Just last episode I was marveling at how in Japan classic novels get made into video games, and now we have this, which is based on Mark Twain's famous novel from 1876. Sort of. Well, I guess not really. In the intro, we see Tom falling asleep in class. I guess that's happened to all of us at some point or another. Once he drifts off, the game begins. So this is sort of one of those cop-out dream games. Rather than depicting events from the novel, the whole thing takes place in a dream, so basically Seta can just fill it up with the standard video game elements. And it's still, technically, a Tom Sawyer game. The game was developed by Winkysoft, another Japanese developer with a terrible name. In the first level, Tom is cruising along on a raft, which fits in with the setting of the novel, I suppose. It's almost like a lame shoot-'em-up level. Now, surprisingly, Seta released this in the US as The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. The title screen and intro are actually almost identical, with one little exception. The animation of Tom falling asleep is gone. When he appears here, he's already asleep. So we fire up the game to stage 1, and... whoa! What the heck is this crap? Jumping over barrels? And then seagulls attack you? And when Tom gets hit, he explodes into a cloud of smoke? Well, Seta made some changes to the game, mostly by rearranging the levels. Instead of starting off with the rafting level, it starts off on the pirate ship level. As you can see, Tom Sawyer is an incredibly primitive-looking side-scrolling platformer. It's very rudimentary. You throw rocks at your enemies, do a little jumping and ladder climbing. Enemies tend to move very quickly and appear unexpectedly, so it's quite easy to die until you have the whole thing memorized. It's actually kind of best to be sort of constantly throwing rocks just in case an enemy appears off the sidelines. It feels sort of unfair and vaguely like the first Transformers game. Here's a pretty good example here. Come across some boxes and... hey, that guy just appeared on top of me! That enormous rat is some sort of mini-boss. Tom Sawyer is a pretty terrible looking game. Check out the stationary fish in the ocean. And for some reason the pirate ship has flying octopuses hovering around. Oh yeah, not to be a pedantic dick here, but the plural of octopus is octopuses, not octopi. Don't confuse an octopus and a cactus. The boss is a giant octopus who's actually very easy. Touching him doesn't harm you, though the little octopuses will do some damage, or they'll kill you. This is like one of those one-hit kill kind of games. But you just stand there and shoot rocks in his eyes. And why is the final boss of the pirate ship a giant octopus? I mean, shouldn't it be like the pirate boss or something? After this, we then go on to the river level. Here you shoot logs, you jump over little land bridges in the river, you have this really stupid looking slow motion jump. A little bit later down the river you'll find people shooting at you and whirlpools. Now you may have noticed that when you shoot an enemy, often a little T icon will appear. If you collect enough of those, you'll get an extra life. However, sometimes a skull icon will appear, and if you accidentally touch one of those, you will lose all your T icons. This boss is way more irritating than the octopus. It's a huge alligator, I guess, who can only be harmed when you shoot the top 2 fangs on the top of his mouth. You actually need to wait till he opens his mouth, then line up a shot between his lower 2 front teeth so that it hits the upper front teeth. It's actually incredibly irksome, and as far as I can tell, it's basically just pure luck. So Tom Sawyer is mostly just plain old Kosoge. It's really visually displeasing. It has lame, boring level design and stupid-looking unfair enemies. So I guess so far, episode 42 is off to a really great start. Now here is a very unusual game from Namco, Wagyan Land. Whoa, what the hell? We're suddenly playing Super Mario World? Let's take a look at that again. That is a pretty cool world map thing, sort of ahead of its time. So, Wagyan Land is, visually speaking, a lot different looking than most any other Famicom game we've seen. It's got all these very simple shapes, clean lines, flat colors. I know, that sounds like just about every Famicom game, but Wagyan Land does have like this very minimalistic approach that makes it look pretty appealing. Now we actually have an English translation here, from Alan Midas. Now you might say, this doesn't look like it needs a translation, I mean there's no words, but it actually does come in extremely handy later. So the story behind Wagyan Land is sort of weird. As far as I can tell, the character was first introduced in like a mechanical arcade game of some sort from Namco. The emotional weapon Wagyan. Oh yeah, and the game is called Wagyan Land, but the character is just Wagyan for some reason. At any rate, Namco created this character in 1987 or so, and then finally in 1989 released a video game starring him. Wagyan has some sort of emotional shouting attack that stuns enemies. You can jump on them while they're stunned. Picking up the Wagyanizers, those funny little Wagyan figures, will increase your power of your stun attack, make it a bit larger and also stun enemies longer. Now once you picked up 4 Wagyanizers, you will get temporary invulnerability. However, you still need to be very careful around the game's enemies. Enemies, no matter how tiny and harmless they look, are all of the one-hit death variety unless they are stunned. Now, Wagyan must go down in history as one of the wussiest video game heroes ever. Little tiny dancing mushrooms, snails, even worms will all cause him to lose a life. After a little while you'll reach a boss, and this is where the game gets kinda weird. Instead of like the typical boss battle, you get challenged to a word game, a deadly word game. The first kind is the word chain. You have a bunch of cards here. One is picked, and then you have to pick another card that starts with the same letter that the previous card ended with. For example, mouse. You need a word now that begins with an E. And there are a few: elbow, ear, egg, and so on. Now this is where the English translation is needed. And even though it is translated into English, it is pretty hard, and actually this translation job is pretty impressive. I mean, how someone actually went about translating this, I really don't know. Anyway, you have to keep getting the right answers until you wear the boss out and he'll quit, or more accurately, he'll die. Yes, it's a word chain battle to the death. The other type of boss battle is the memory game. Now I'm sure you've played this before. You turn over a card and then you try to find the matching card. It requires a good memory, or maybe save states. Either one will work. But it does seem like the computer cheats. If you're doing well, the other guy will suddenly get like a whole bunch of like really lucky guesses in a row. Oh yeah, and I love this boss. He's like a medic robot with a jackhammer. I suppose that if Wagyan Land has one major flaw, it's the boss battles. I mean, the word chain in particular can be very frustrating. But note that many pictures have multiple words attached to them. Like here. Can't find anything that starts with a K? Well, click on the octopus squid thing. Oh, it's Kraken. That's a bit of a stretch. I mean, who would ever guess that? Unless you speak one of those Germanic languages where that's what the animal is actually called. And the level design can be creative at times. This level is actually like a series of slides and jumps. You can pick up quite a bit of speed, so it might remind you just a little tiny bit of like the Sonic the Hedgehog games. Still, we really can't consider Wagyan Land to be some sort of lost classic. I mean, it's a cute game and relatively slick, but it doesn't really go to greatness. Parts are very easy and boring, just walking around and avoiding slow-moving enemies, and then you encounter really frustrating moments. One thing I hate are these springboards. There's a few of these, and in some it's really easy to fall short for some reason. I fell to my death a few times on one springboard in the last level. Now there is some sort of plot that develops, believe it or not. Wagyan reaches his old village, which appears to be empty. He does however encounter this old man who seriously upgrades his weapon with the Super Wagonator. Now once you have this, you can shout out a deadly wave beam that will pretty much allow you to just sort of plow your way through enemies. Now near the end of the game, you'll even find these weird bonus levels. Before too long, you'll discover that it came that the Wagyan people were kidnapped by someone called Dr. Devil. The last couple levels lead to his lair. There is a somewhat tricky section where you need to move upward into the sky by jumping on clouds. Since you can't see very far above you, it's really easy to reach a dead end, so to speak. Finally, you reach the last level, which is mostly like a lot of jumping, and at the very end you encounter Dr. Devil, who is a rather smug-looking bastard who resembles Dr. Wily. But lord, is that guy rocking some tight pants! And he has an unusually prominent package for a video game character. I mean, really, that guy's pants are pretty much obscene. Then Dr. Devil challenges you to a memory card game, and then a word chain game. Unfortunately, I am very sad to report that I really can't show you the ending because I could not win the final battle. The memory game isn't really that bad, but the word chain is very long and impossible. I kept getting stuck in unwinnable situations, where I checked every single card, and none started with the letter I needed. I restarted the battle multiple times, but every single time it would just end with me getting stuck. I don't know if this is an issue in the original Japanese version, or just the translated one, but it's a shame. So, Wagyan Land is an interesting but very flawed game. Let's hope Namco is able to produce a better sequel. Okay, here's a game from Sunsoft, Sekiryuou. Their last Japanese game was Nankin no Adventure. This one's also an adventure game based on a manga. Like we was saying in Chrontendo 41, adventure games were just huge and non-stoppable in Japan at this point. I like this rather dramatic opening here. For our purposes, this is probably the most interesting part of the game. The title means literally Red Dragon King, though the actual transliteration kind of confuses me. The word red, or the character red as far as I can tell, is normally written or spelled as Aka, but every single time I see this game written out in Roman characters, it's Seki, so why it's pronounced Seki in this case as opposed to Aka, I really have no idea. Anyway, it's based on a manga by a guy called Hiroshimoto Miya. This seems pretty obscure, at least outside Japan. It concerns a period of unrest in Chinese history between the Qin and the Han dynasties. Of course, when one dynasty ends and another begins, you'll often find some kind of civil war or unrest or something like that going on. Well, anyway, what can I say about this game? Well, it's another adventure game. You walk around, talk to people, move around from location to location. I'm getting sort of tired of these. I'm not really sure how many more I can take before I crack. At least this one has nice, clean looking graphics. I don't know for sure if it was developed internally at Sunsoft or was, handed out to somebody else, but I guess the end result looks reasonably nice. For those of you playing along at home, you might have noticed on February 10th there was another game released aside from Sekiryuou. It was the second disc of Data East's latest Tantei Jinguchi Saburo game. But we already covered that way back in episode 38 when the first disc came out. So, moving along to February 11th, we have another murder mystery adventure game. Yamamura Misa Suspense, Kyouto Hana no Misshitsu Satsujin Jiken, from Taito and Tosa. You know how last episode I mentioned the Nishimura Kyotaru game and said it was the second Famicom game based on the work of a popular mystery novelist? Well, the very first such game was the first Yamamura Misa Suspense game covered back in Chrontendo 26, the episode with Final Fantasy and Mega Man. Now, the first game had like a Kyouto theme, and so does this one, cherry blossoms right off the bat, and a guy gets poisoned. When people get poisoned, they always drop the cup or whatever, and then there's like a shot of the poison drink spilling out onto the ground. No one ever puts the cup down first, then dies. I guess that would be less dramatic. So once again, there's cherry blossoms everywhere and a dead body, and need to solve the murder with the help of your pretty blonde assistant. Those of you with exceptional memories will recall that the Yamamura Misa Suspense games use a graphical interface with little picture icons instead of the standard written out words. The ear is for talk, since, as someone pointed out way back then, the word kiku means both listen and talk. Of course, when you talk, the other person talks back, so I guess that makes sense in a way. One nice touch, the icons vary depending on the context. You'll only see the useful icons. When there is something to pick up, the hand icon appears. When you can move to another location, the foot icon appears, and so on. It seems most other adventure games that use icons have a static bar, so I guess the dynamic action bar is a bit of an advancement. The first game had a static bar, as I recall. So once again, this is a pretty slick title, especially from Toza. I feel like they are slowly but surely making more appealing games. We are actually going to have a couple more Toza games later this episode. It's time to check out February's US games. We've got 4 games this time, released specially for the US market, starting with Bert from Ultra Games. Nintendo of America only allowed 5 games per year from any one publisher back then, but Konami was able to release more games since they had a secondary imprint, Ultra Games. The only other publisher to do this was Acclaim, when they bought LJN. But I think Konami and Acclaim were on pretty good terms with Nintendo of America, so they sometimes got some special treatment. Anyway, Bert is a port of the 1982 hit arcade game, originally from Gottlieb. One unusual feature is the ability to customize the control scheme. You hardly ever saw this back then. Of course, Bert is sort of awkward to play using a D-pad, so I suppose the customizable controls make sense. I'll assume everyone watching this is at least somewhat familiar with Bert. The original was one of the most successful arcade games of the early 1980s. It was noted for its unique gameplay. When the arcades were full of space shooters and maze games, this really stuck out. Also, when you died, the speech synthesizer produced some gibberishy sounds, which the speech bubble indicated was Bert cussing. Back then, that was considered to be pretty funny. Various home ports came out, the Atari 2600, the 5200, ColecoVision, Commodore 64, and so on. None of these were completely satisfactory, so I suppose the Nintendo version was actually the best one released up to this point. Now the object is simply to change every block to the correct color by jumping on it. You can jump in the 4 diagonal directions. You can't jump straight left or right to the block directly next to you for some reason. Now this presents a bit of a problem with the controls. It's recommended you actually turn the controller 45 degrees so that the D-pad buttons correspond to the direction that Bert actually can move. But you know, after years of holding the Nintendo controller a certain way, you don't just change things up and expect your brain to play along. So I found myself accidentally jumping the wrong direction many times. With a bit of practice, this would get easier, I'm sure, but Bert is much better played in the arcade with a joystick. And the arcade version also seems to have more responsive controls. Still, Bert's not bad, it's pretty fun. It's definitely a hard game. The enemies move around in an unpredictable fashion, so they can be difficult to avoid. And while this is hardly a perfect port, it's not bad and definitely acceptable by 1989 standards. Well, here it is, the big game this episode, and perhaps the most well-remembered sports game on the NES, Tecmo Bowl. Now, this isn't quite a Western-only release. It did eventually get released in Japan in late 1990, however it was clearly designed for the US market. Now, you may have seen the NFL Players Association logo there. That is, Tecmo has officially licensed the names of the players, but since Tecmo did not have the actual NFL license, no team names are given. There was an official NFL football game released later in 1989, but it is, sadly, NFL football from LJN, a game which is almost entirely forgotten today. Now, it seems kinda weird to have the rights to the NFL and the rights to the NFL players being licensed to separate companies, but that was actually kinda normal back then. A few years after this, of course, Electronic Arts would acquire both licenses for the Madden series, where they still remain today. Like so many other Tecmo games, this was originally found in arcades. It came out in 1987 and had a dual-screen setup. As far as I know, it didn't make much of an impression at the time. This is sort of the same deal as Ninja Gaiden. The arcade version's almost forgotten today, whereas the home version is considered to be a classic. Now, there's a theory among video game aficionados that the less realistic a sports game is, the more fun it is to play, and this theory explains why Tecmo Bowl is so great. It's pretty simple in terms of the controls and the various options you have for plays and so on. Tecmo Bowl definitely goes down the ease of use path. This is the complete opposite approach of the Madden football series. You might remember we just saw the first Madden game in the 1988 Computer Roundup. The first Madden game would let you control virtually every aspect of the game. You could make custom playbooks, you could even change the weather. Tecmo Bowl has none of that. There are only 4 plays to choose from. Granted, the plays vary a bit from team to team, but you have 2 passing and 2 running plays available for any given team. Here I've chosen the run option. You just hand the ball to your running back, and away you go. I have Walter Payton here, as you can see up at the top of the screen. Like I said, everything is very simplified. There are no fumbles in the game. Once you've got the ball, the only way they can stop you is by tackling you. Passes are also very simple. You control the quarterback at first. Once your receiver is clear, hit the button to throw the ball to him. Each player has their own set of stats, but really speed seems to be the biggest factor here. The physics are completely unrealistic. During a tackle, players go flying all over the place. Players will often jump way up in the air in order to try to intercept a ball. But all of this just adds to the fun. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what makes Tecmo Bowl so great. I guess a lot of the little things add up, like the catchy music, or the easy-to-use controls. I mean, you can just pick them up and figure out how to play the game. It's not something like Skate or Die, where you have this horrendous, complicated control scheme that changed depending on what you were doing. And the game seems really balanced. There aren't any no-fair moments. All in all, it's another great achievement for Tecmo, and a huge improvement over Tecmo Baseball. It really stands up with the other classic NES sports games like Super Dodgeball, or Blades of Steel, or Double Dribble. Our next game is Bandai Golf Pebble Beach Challenge. You think with all the golf games that came out in Japan, we'd see a localization of one of those games, but no, Bandai released a brand new game just for the US market. Developed by, anybody want to take a guess? Well, who else but Tosa. I say this is a brand new game, but really, it's just like every other Famicom golf game. If there's any difference, it's probably the sort of confusing display and controls. Like, for example, why are there 2 flashing dots here? I guess it's to constantly remind you that it's player 1's turn? Now, selecting course allows you to view the layout of this particular hole. It gives you like a weird looking side view, along with the more common top-down viewpoint. Of course, you need to choose your clubs, adjust the cursor to indicate the direction that you want to hit the ball, And of course, to hit the ball, you perform the now standard 3-button press maneuver. Every single golf game we've seen has used this. I really don't need to explain it by this point. As you probably figure out, this takes place on Pebble Beach, the famous golf course located on a spectacular stretch of the California coastline near Monterey. If you're not familiar with the area, well, it's really beautiful and expensive, and like Clint Eastwood hangs out there. And there's a very famous cypress tree. I suppose basing the course on Pebble Beach was the only reason this game was created, as opposed to just releasing like an English version of a Japanese game. Now there are a few eccentricities, like it's really hard to get the ball to drop in the hole sometimes. If you putt it too hard, it'll like always bounce out. But for the most part, it's really just like every other 8-bit golf game. Okay, let's get this one out of the way. Here is today's most infamous game, Friday the 13th from LJN. At least this intro is pretty cool. And I'll admit, I think the music is not that bad, though it is simple and repetitive. We've heard way worse. Friday the 13th sometimes makes those worst NES game lists. And I agree this is not really a fantastic video game, but it's not really that bad either. The art and music are professional looking, the interface isn't too confusing or awkward, and the gameplay is a little obnoxious. There was also a Friday the 13th computer game, but this one is completely different. So you have 6 counselors scattered throughout the camp, and you start by picking one. Each has different stats. This is sort of like Maniac Mansion, I guess. Though in this case, all but 2 of the counselors are pretty worthless. Also, once a counselor dies, they are gone permanently, and you then have to pick one of the remaining ones. So when you start out the game, you walk outside and get attacked by zombies, which seems kind of weird because there were no zombies in the movies. You can throw rocks, but these will sail over the zombies' heads unless you kneel down. I mean, seriously, how hard is it to hit a zombie with a rock? What does killing the zombies do? Well, not much really. They're mostly just distractions. They do drop items or weapons occasionally. One of the things you can do while running around Crystal Lake is enter the houses. These houses are mostly empty. Sometimes there'll be a note inside. A few have fireplaces, which you can use to light a fire, if you have like the one-time use lighter in your inventory. Some cabins have another counselor or the kids that you see mentioned in the upper left corner. So other than running around going into houses, what's the purpose of this game? Well, it's not a game like Super Mario Bros. There is no end to the level, nor are there even really levels. You have a series of pathways that sort of loop around in a circle. No, the object is to kill Jason. Well, how do you kill him? Well, you need to defeat him in combat 3 times. The first 2 times you defeat him, he returns the next day more powerful. So, why can't you just walk up to Jason and kill him? Because he tends to appear in random places and then disappears after you do a certain amount of damage. You then need to find him again. Every so often the game warns you that Jason has been spotted, and the timer starts counting down. You then need to look at the map and then hustle the hell over to the location where Jason is. Take too long and he'll start killing the kids. When you reach the cabin where Jason is, you'll have like a little battle with him, and this is where the game starts getting sketchy. The first time you try to fight Jason, you'll probably get killed really quickly. That's because the fighting mechanics work pretty much like no other video game ever. It's tricky, but when Jason approaches you, you need to hit down on the D-pad and then either left or right to lean and avoid his blow. If you just try to move to the left or right without hitting down first, you won't be quick enough and you'll get hit. However, the game manual doesn't really tell you how to perform this maneuver, and mastering this is the only way you can possibly survive a fight with Jason. Then of course you attack Jason when he's not too close to you, and eventually you'll shave off a couple bars from his health meter. He'll then split, and if you run outside you can often find Jason on the road and fight him again. Then just basically keep repeating this until you've worn down his life bar. Then the next day, it starts again. Everything is exactly the same, only now Jason is faster and tougher. Aside from fighting Jason, you'll pick up items such as potions to restore a teeny tiny bit of health, or lighters, or better weapons like the knife. The knife will just occasionally just appear, but for better weapons like the machete or the torch, you have to either get lucky and find a random drop, or go out of your way to find it by doing some kind of weird sequence of events, like lighting all the fireplaces. or you can enter a cave and defeat Jason's mother, who has a flying decapitated head. However, I wandered around the cave quite a bit and couldn't actually find her. It's kind of hard to tell your way around because all the screens kind of look the same. There's a bit of mystery over who developed this game, though Game Developer Research Institute has dug up a bit of information. Like the other LJN releases of the era, Atlus was responsible for producing the game. However, Atlus subcontracted titles out to other developers like Sonritsu and Westone. It is known that the music was contracted out, and probably the programming was as well. The structure of Friday the 13th reminds me a lot of LJN's Jaws game. Both are relatively non-linear games in which you sort of freely move around on a small overworld. You have one major boss enemy, Jaws, or Jason, whom you randomly encounter while running around the world. Most of the time is spent moving around from location to location trying to obtain items to make you more powerful to kill the boss. And both games can be completed quite quickly if you know what you're doing. There really aren't very many other games like this on the Famicom or NES. The fact that Friday the 13th just feels sort of weird and different and confusing, and the fact that the mechanics are hard to master, cause a lot of people to really hate this game. Also, there's very little variety. The same zombies appear over and over again, and everybody's sort of walking around in a circle past the same scenery again and again. It's pretty repetitive. Still, it requires a certain amount of experimentation and fooling around in order to figure out how to kill Jason, and that does appeal to some folks. However, most people are not going to like this game, myself included. Okay, we're back to Japanese releases. Here's another one from Bandai on February 15th. Famicom Jump, Eiyuu Retsuden. Once again developed by Tosa. I guess at this point Tosa had become the most prolific developer for the Famicom. That's 4 games this episode. At least that we know of. When's the last time we even saw a Nintendo developed game? At this point, as far as I'm concerned, the Famicom is Tosa's console. They're the one making all the games. Anyway, look at this title scroll, in English for some reason. This is the old kid reading a book somehow gets sucked into the alternate reality inside the book thing. Same idea used for Konami's old action RPG, Esper Dream. And, I guess sort of similar to Action 52, I suppose. Well, anyway, Famicom Jump is a joint project between Bandai and the comic magazine Shonen Jump. Weekly Shonen Jump has been around since the late 60s, and tons of successful manga series originated there. Dragon Ball, Fist of the North Star, Captain Tsubasa, High School Kimengumi, City Hunter, Kinnikuman, everything. Nowadays, I guess Naruto would be the most well-known Shonen Jump series. The idea behind Famicom Jump is that it features like an all-star cast of characters from the magazine, so it's sort of like Bandai's version of YY World, the Konami All-Stars game. However, as good as that sounds in theory, Famicom Jump is a pretty clunky action RPG thing. That's your main character there, moves very slowly most of the time. As you wander around, you'll see enemies visible in the overworld. If you get too close, you may be forced to fight them. And this is where the game gets ugly. You engage in these little duels where you and the enemy duke it out. These guys with mustaches will fire projectiles out of their fists, which is pretty annoying. So basically you need to like bob and weave and avoid their bullets while trying to shoot them with your weapon. Frequently the two bolts will actually hit each other in mid-air. The other enemies don't seem to have projectile weapons and will just try to punch you. And for some reason they seem to have abnormally large fists. Along the way you'll encounter tougher enemies and have like these boss fight type things here. Again, this is done by having 2 teeny tiny sprites run around on the screen trying to hit each other. Whatever the merits of this game might be, the battle mechanics seem far too annoying to play this for very long. Naturally, you'll eventually come across some towns with shops. This looks like it's straight out of the Fist of the North Star. You'll also need to hunt down the other party members. Here's the first one I found. Nuka Saku Ida, from a humor comic called Suide ni Tonchinaken. I can only hope That is, you get new allies with new abilities, the battles become less annoying. So, Famicom Jump, it's sort of an interesting idea, but Tosa and Bandai haven't had much luck with this sort of game so far. I guess a good action RPG is really hard to make. Maybe the sequel will be better. I'd say that from a purely aesthetic perspective, this is the best part of the game. Alright, so what we have here is Space Shadow from Bandai, again, and this is a light gun game. It seems like we haven't really seen a whole lot of light gun games on the Famicom. I mean, in the US, of course, stuff like Duck Hunt was very popular, but in Japan, apparently not so much. However, this is a bit different since Bandai created a pretty amazing looking light gun called the Hypershot. It basically looks like a machine gun, like an Uzi or something. Space Shadow was the game that came packaged with the Hypershot. The only question is, if you went through all the trouble to have creating a light gun this cool looking, why would you package it with such a terrible game? Unless I'm drastically misunderstanding this game, it seems Space Shadow is about the most elementary, repetitive light gun game you could possibly imagine. You walk down the corridors, and in every section one enemy appears. You shoot the enemy over and over until it dies. You then go on to the next screen and repeat. The enemies attack you by throwing something that looks like a kidney. Space Shadow, I guess, is very influenced by the movie Alien, so I guess the thing they throw is supposed to be like a baby alien, like a face hugger or something? Anyway, after about 8 screens or so of this, you have a boss battle, and this is the same thing only with a bigger alien. And man, these bosses take forever to kill. Really, these things just go on and on and on. This is not one of those games where you die because it's difficult. You die because you get so bored and frustrated your attention starts to waver. And eventually you just stop caring if you get hit or not. You just want it to be over. If I was going to give you guys a hint for playing Space Shadow, I'd say don't do it. But aside from that, save your grenades for the boss battles. They make them go by a bit faster. Now, maybe I'm doing something wrong, maybe there are certain weak spots you're supposed to be attacking, I really can't tell. Light gun games, as a genre, tend to be sort of repetitive, but this has got to be about the most boring one I've ever seen. There were a couple Famicom Disk System games released in February. The system's still putting along, though just barely. By mid-1989, the only major publishers to still be releasing new FDS games will be Nintendo themselves. So Roger Rabbit is a Kemco game based on the 1988 movie that combined live-action and animated characters. The movie was produced by Steven Spielberg's Amblin production company and Disney Studios. The credits show the programming as being by Kotobuki, that is, Kemco themselves. Now, Roger Rabbit the game is based very loosely on the film, and by that I mean not at all. It's really just a Lode Runner type game, with sprites that look like characters from the movie. The object is to collect the various hearts found scattered around the level, while avoiding the zoot-suited bad guys. Now here's the weird thing, despite being a rabbit, Roger cannot jump nor run. His main method of vertical transportation is climbing stairs, which is quite unusual for a rabbit. The doorways that you see are stairways that allow you to move up one floor. Now Roger is even more helpless than the Lode Runner guy since he can't dig holes or anything to protect himself from his pursuers. Luckily the game is way easier than Lode Runner, which had some really difficult tricky puzzles in it. In fact, Lode Runner was actually quite sadistic if you recall some of the Lode Runner games that we've seen. Now at this point you might say, I know I've played this game before under a different name. Yeah, you see, in August of 1989, Kemco released the game in the US as Bugs Bunny's Crazy Castle, the exact same game with new sprites. The hearts were replaced with carrots, and other Warner Brothers characters such as Sylvester, Wily, and Coyote, Yosemite Sam are put in as the enemies. This must have been because LJN had the US video game rights for Roger Rabbit, and they released a completely different Roger Rabbit game around the same time that Crazy Castle came out in the US. So the game itself is none too exciting. There are 60 levels, none of which are really that complicated or difficult. Later levels have different themes, like plumbing tubes instead of doorways and that sort of thing. You'll often find special items, like a one-time use boxing glove that you can use to kill one enemy. Use it if you get cornered or something like that. This is the first game in what's usually referred to as the Crazy Castle series. This is a confusing sort of series of games, which are notable because they almost always feature different characters in Japan than in the US. In Japan, Kemco had the rights for the Disney characters, and most of the games featured Mickey Mouse. But the US and European versions of these same Japanese games starred Bugs Bunny, the Ghostbusters, Garfield, and an original character called Kid Clown. And these were most released for the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance. But Bugs Bunny did appear in a couple of the later Japanese games, and the last game had Woody Woodpecker, so it's actually quite strange and confusing. Once you complete the final level, you'll get a closing screen of Bugs and some female rabbit. It's really not very exciting. Though Roger Rabbit, the original game, had a better ending. You get this little animated cutscene of Roger rescuing Jessica. I suppose the presence of Jessica Rabbit makes the ending a bit sexier. While I wouldn't really call this game Kusoge or anything, it is a pretty simple puzzle platformer, and there's nothing really wrong with that, but just like Kemco's Donald Duck or Snoopy game that we saw earlier, there's really nothing special about it. Now here's a surprising one from Namco, Hydlide 3. Now I'm sure you all remember the original Hydlide, which came out for the Famicom back in 1986. It was released by Toshiba EMI in Japan and FCI in the US. And actually, as of February 1989, Hydlide, the first game, hadn't even come out in the US yet. It was released over here in June. The first game is pretty notorious on the internet, for a couple reasons. Its soundtrack greatly resembled the main theme from Raiders of the Lost Ark. And also, it was an incredibly primitive and frustrating action RPG. With Hydlide 3, the series has been dragged kicking and screaming into the modern age, starting with this fancy animated intro. Now you might be wondering, what happened to Hydlide 2? Well, the first Hydlide came out for Japanese computers in 1985. The second game was released in 1986, also for computers like the MSX and PC-88. For some reason, it never got a console version. Hydlide 3 was naturally also originally a computer game and came out in 1987. For example, here is the MSX version. It did make some concessions to fit in with the popular Dragon Quest style RPGs of the era, but it's still a pretty ugly and awkward experience. Now, the Famicom port was the first of two console versions. What's going on here is that you're actually choosing a class, fighter, wizard, etc. And once you start the game, you'll see there are towns, shops, and so on. You can talk to NPCs. The first game has pretty much none of this stuff. So Hydlide 3 seems much more like a typical JRPG of the era. Then later in 1989, it received a second port to the Genesis of all things as Super Hydlide. The Genesis version actually did come out in the US, unlike the Famicom version. And despite looking, pretty awful for a Genesis game, it's still considered to be the best version of Hydlide 3. So here's the thing. I'm not really going to go into Hydlide 3 in any detail because at some point we'll be covering the superior Genesis version. Though, as you can probably tell by looking at this footage from the beginning of the game, where you fight a bunch of living trees, you can probably see that this is sort of hampered by the same awkward action RPG battles as the first Hydlide, so you're really not missing that much. Wow, what a weird title screen. The ing in flying is written out in English for some reason. And what is this guy, an astronaut? Jet pilot? Well, no, he's actually a fireman, or rather a trampoline jumping fire rescue specialist of some sort. So, remember that game, Megumi Rescue, from the last episode of Chrontendo? Came out in July 1988 in Japan for the Master System? Well, this is really just a heavily altered version of that. You control the trampoline down to the bottom, use it to bounce your firefighter up in the air to the windows, grab folks, and then get them to safety. You also use the opportunity to loot the buildings by grabbing things like bags of cash and the occasional special items that'll bring along a rain cloud to put out a fire or something like that. Now, Flying Hero's similarity to Megumi Rescue is not coincidental. Both were developed by ICOM, a company whose output has been inconsistent, to say the least. They've made some sort of terrible games like Amagon, and awesome games like Legendary Axe for the TurboGrafx 16. Later, they would go on to do stuff like the amazing-looking shoot-'em-up Polestar for the Neo Geo. Incidentally, this Flying Hero has no connection to the Super Famicom shoot-'em-up, also called Flying Hero. The later Flying Hero was developed by Sting, of all people. So Flying Hero is certainly not one of their better efforts, but it's decent, I suppose. I would say that Megumi Rescue is more fun and looked nicer. It's pretty hard to aim your guy using the trampoline, so you just sort of fly around randomly in the air a lot. You also frequently have a falling object on one side of the screen, and your firefighter will be on the other side of the screen, so there's no way that you can catch both the firefighter and the item, so you tend to miss a lot of the bonus items. This was published by Epic Sony, Epic being the record company, not the guys who made Unreal. I wonder if they knew or cared that ICOM was basically just remaking one of their earlier games. Okay, here's another one from ASCII, a Japanese software publisher that seems to specialize almost exclusively in computer ports. Now, the title is a little confusing. The box art identifies it as Wizardry 2, the third scenario, Legacy of Llylgamyn. You might recall ASCII released a port of the first Wizardry back in 1987. Now, you might think that based on the title, Wizardry 2, this is like a port of the second Wizardry game. But no, Legacy of Llylgamyn is actually Wizardry 3, hence this is titled the third scenario. Later, ASCII released Wizardry 2, the second scenario, Knight of Diamonds, which really was a port of Wizardry 2. So the question is, why did they release Wizardry 3 before Wizardry 2? I guess we'll never know. Now, the original Wizardry 3 came out for the Apple computer back in 1983. This one has a relatively fancy little intro describing the plot. But when you fire up the game and play it, you'll see it's almost exactly like Wizardry 1 and 2. And just like 2, you can't create characters, you need to import them from the previous game. Also, it is absurdly hard. To illustrate, RPG Addict said in his blog that he had a character die in 9 out of the first 10 battles. And reviving characters is impossibly expensive early in the game. You also need to create lots of characters, since certain levels cannot be accessed by characters of certain alignments. The whole thing sounds like a royal pain. Now, the Famicom version is not that painful. Obviously, you can create your own characters, and even comes with some generic characters pre-created. The entire game is basically just wandering around in first-person dungeons and then killing stuff for loot and money. And you better break out the graph paper because you're never going to find a way around without a map. Every room looks exactly the same. Expect to take a lot of damage, have characters get killed, and never have enough money to heal everyone. For those of you who have mostly played Japanese RPGs, be aware that healing is actually a lot more difficult in games like Wizardry. Well, in this case, healing requires staying at the inn for weeks and weeks, which ages the character, and they can eventually die of old age. Now, this particular port was developed by Game Arts, just like the first one. Game Arts also did the third Famicom Wizardry game, but that one got a US release. Legacy of Llylgamyn, for some reason, did not. Okay, we're almost done today. A few more to go. such as this one from the rather obscure Use software, or perhaps Yusa if you were to look at the Japanese characters. This is Hyakkiyakou, sort of an odd supernatural themed RPG. There's a rather lengthy opening sequence here, but let's discuss the name real quick. The term Hyakkiyakou is often translated into English as Night of the 100 Demons. That is, it's a night when demons or spirits walk the earth, kind of like the Japanese Halloween. The Japanese do have like a weird thing for ghosts and demons and whatnot, so the Hyakkiyakou is something that turns up in Japanese fiction and art, from time to time. When I first started doing Chrontendo, I assumed there were going to be tons and tons of RPGs on the Famicom. And I suppose there are quite a few, though if you saw that 1988 roundup last episode, you'll know that as a percentage of total games, the RPG wasn't exactly the biggest genre in Japan at the time. And a surprising number of these are not what we would call Dragon Quest clones. There have been a lot of action RPGs, Wizardry clones, and sort of oddball games like this one. So there seem to be a lot of these forest maze things. At first it's hard to distinguish the parts you can walk on from the parts that you can't. Walking around, you'll find enemies just milling about. Often these can't really be avoided because your maze thingy will actually lead you directly to them and you can't just walk around them. Battles are turn-based and pretty standard except for the rather boring-looking battle screen. There are actually quite a few RPGs at this time that don't use random battles. Later, of course, when everyone equated Japanese RPGs with Square games, non-random encounters seem very much out of the ordinary. But as we've seen, this wasn't always the case. Famicom Jump is just one of the many other games where you can see enemies visible on the overworld. Hyakkiyakou also uses what I would call the Ys style of world map. This is opposed to the Ultima or Dragon Quest style map, where when you exit a town you become like an enormous avatar which walks around on a miniature map. Here the regular overworld and towns are all on the same scale. Another interesting feature is that your character is more realistically proportioned than the squat, childlike characters found in most Japanese RPGs. All in all, this is a little bit different than most RPGs at the time. It doesn't seem particularly well made or very exciting, but it does show that there was more variety back then in RPGs than you might realize. We have yet another Bandai game, this time on the Famicom Disk System. For those keeping track, this is Bandai game number 4 this episode. 4 games, Bandai just never lets up. Now we don't know if this is developed by Toza or someone else, but we do know that it's about a cute little kitty cat. Tama and Friends, 3 Choume Dai Bouken. The 3 Choume part refers to where Tama lives. In the Japanese address system, many towns have a number followed by Choume, which designates a particular district of a town. Tama and Friends was owned by Sony, and I believe it started life as characters on stationery products. A little later there was an animated Tama series. The series even aired in the US on cable TV, so it's perhaps a bit less obscure than some of the other kiddie TV series games we've been seeing. Alright, so here we go. Tama was aimed at young children, and I'm pretty sure this game was too. Tama can jump, climb up telephone poles, and walk along walls and so on. I'm not even really sure what the point of this game is. It seems that you just walk right until you reach the end of the level. You don't get very far before enemies start moving across the screen. Tama can jump on enemies and put them out of commission. Getting hit will drain your life bar, represented by the hearts on the bottom left of the screen. Aside from birds, you have like random junk fall on your head, a lot of baseballs are flying around, and things that I guess are tin cans. Probably the excessive amount of stuff that falls on you is the most irritating part of this game. As mentioned, one thing Tama can do is climb up telephone poles. Every once in a while this will lead you to like a Super Mario-like bonus level. Except in Super Mario, you had like that moving cloud that carried you across the level, so it was a bit more, exciting. Also, when you get to the end level, it drops you down in the same spot where you climbed up the pole, which doesn't really make much sense from like a geographical perspective. Like I was saying, I think this is a children's game, and while the simplicity of gameplay makes me think it was designed for the young ones, it's actually a bit hard. It had its moments where you jump and then an enemy comes flying out and hits you mid-jump. With a bit of dedication, you could get through the game, but really, who can muster up the enthusiasm to get all the way through this thing? It's pretty boring. Okay, here's the first boss, a dog, naturally. One little trick, stand behind him, he won't turn around. And then, more of the same damn crap. Now, I really shouldn't be too hard on Tama and Friends. I mean, Bandai has certainly released worse games, and there have been games like that are a lot uglier, but it's not so much terrible as it's just boring. Our very last game today, and the last game from February, is from Konami. Ganbare Pennant Race. What? Another Ganbare Goemon game? Already? Well, sort of, but not really. Ganbare Pennant Race is actually a baseball game. Now, is this Konami's first baseball game? I don't recall. Okay, we have the open mode, which is for the one-off games, as well as like the pennant mode, etc. This is for 1 or 2 players. The teams are all silly-sounding fictional names, some of which have Konami-themed names, like Gyrus or Gomontai. You also get your choice of 3 stadiums, which is a nice touch. It's odd that Ganbare Goemon 2 just came out in January, and then next month they are cramming him into a baseball game of all things. When you choose the Gomontai team, all the players look like Goemon. I guess Goemon was sort of a Konami mascot, so I guess this really isn't any different than Nintendo putting Mario into a bunch of sports games. As far as baseball games go, this is pretty decent. It's really hard to get a good hit in against the CPU. It seems like every single hit is just like a slow pop fly that gets easily caught by the CPU's team. It's hard to even hit the ball at all. I had a lot of strikes in this game. I just couldn't seem to get the timing right. It always looked like my bat was just passing right through the ball. The CPU's pitcher is pretty tricky and throws a lot of curveballs and that go just a little bit outside the batting box. When you get a home run, however, you do get this little animation. The production values are pretty high and the music is great. Seriously, this has just about the best music of any baseball game I've heard so far. Let's take a listen. Now, I don't exactly love this game. When you're pitching, the CPU tends to get these powerful line drives over and over again. Also, it's really difficult to determine where a high ball is going to land while it's still high up in the air. I missed a lot of fly balls, whereas the CPU always knows exactly where to stand to catch the ball. This gets pretty tiresome. Is Ganbare Pennant Race a great game? No, but it is a decent baseball game that never got a US release, for obvious reasons. Okay, that finishes up February. What next? Well, I will try to squeeze all of March into episode 43. It's going to be a lot of games, however. But there will actually be a lot of interesting stuff. Some arcade ports, a classic NES port of a US computer game, and a Japanese adventure game with a really weird title from Chunsoft, the guys behind Dragon Quest. And another ill-conceived port of a Sega Super Scalar game. Well, we'll see you next time.